Alright, gang! Hard men assemble! I'm a hard man! Alright, so I might do some more of these political contexts of the different modern wars, or the circumstances of these different wars. But I think I'm going to start with World War I, because it's very important and vital to understanding our modern contemporary history, even more so than World War II probably, because it is the first true total war as such. So, the European context of what was going on in the 3 or 4 decades before World War I, there was a lot of alliance buildup, or buildup of alliances that were taking place. So primarily, the real reason for World War I was the end of the age of colonialism, or the so-called golden age of colonialism and imperialism, and imperialist buildup between the British and the Germans. So, for a very long time, the British and the French were rivals, and the British and the French were the main rivals in Western Europe for centuries. And even in the late 1800s, France and Great Britain were still the strongest rivals of each other. Yet by 1904, 1906, they were allies, together with the Russians, and the Germans were the primary rivals of the British. So the geopolitics actually changed. Now, there was the League of the Three Emperors between Tsarist Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Germany. But that gradually withered away and was replaced by the Entente Cordiale, or Entente Cordiale. And that was basically the Triple Entente, les Triers d'Entente, which had Great Britain, Russia, and France, Serbia, Belgium, and so forth in one alliance. And on the other alliance, the other main alliance was the Central Powers, which was Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottomans. So, World War I is usually referred to as the graveyard of the empires. And it is very significant in terms of understanding all of the context of what happened and what followed after 1918. So on the one hand, we have very modern industrialized or industrializing countries that have undergone the processes of the legacy of the Industrial Revolution. Germany was unified in 1871 by Bismarck, and almost immediately, that country underwent a scientific and technological breakthrough. It was practically the crucibus of the building of Europe come the turn of the 20th century. But Germany was held back by a 18th, 17th century Hohenzollern system. It was a monarchy, an absolute monarchy, in the shape of the Bourbons before the French Revolution. But Germany was also a Protestant country. It was Lutheran. So Germany was about half Lutheran and half Roman Catholic. Bavaria, Baden, Württemberg, Wittenberg, all of the south was Catholic, which made it very hard for Bismarck to pull those kingdoms and duchies out of the grip of the Habsburgs and under the influence of Prussia. And then Prussia, Schleswig-Holstein, Oldenburg, Saxony, and all these other northern states were Protestant. And Germany was pretty much torn apart by the 30 Years' War. And then because of that, because of the 30 Years' War, Germany was a plaything of the great powers. Like, if you look at a map of Germany in the late 1700s, it was practically nothing. Napoleon Bonaparte stepped in, and he turned 360 different principalities, duchies, dukedoms, ecclesiastical episcopacies, imperial league cities and stuff, and turned it into a federation of 38 different kingdoms. And by the time of Bismarck, Germany defeated France, well, Prussia alone, with the North German Federation, defeated France, which, only 40 years before was unthinkable. But in the 1860s, Germany got a very good railroad system, which it got from the British. It got its railroad technology from the British, and they finally unified. But when Germany unified, it was still under a medieval system of government. Even though the Prussians were Lutheran and Calvinist, and there had even been Calvinist kings of Prussia in the 1600s, Germany was still run by a very medieval government, and the Germans themselves did not even really see themselves as a unified nationality. They still saw themselves as Bavarians, Prussians, Saxons, Hanoverians, and so forth and the like. So it took a long time for the Germans to build a distinct nationality of sorts. And even today, there's still very strong regional differences, but because of the Industrial Revolution and because of the railroads and because of Germany being able to utilize its resources with its coal mines and its railroads and coke deposits. I'm not talking about coke as in cocaine, I'm talking about coal. Germany surpassed Britain in its engineering. So the Germans became the leaders of the world in terms of engineering, chemical processing, and railroad building and stuff. And the Germans mirrored the British and the French, and it went and got colonies. And they got quite a few colonies in Africa. They weren't exactly the best. They were second-rate colonies, because by the time Germany actually got into becoming a colonial power, they came in very late. They came late into the game, and Bismarck wanted to maintain a balance of power, and he was right about that. Bismarck wanted to do the best he could to stay on the good side of the Tsar, and he tried his best to mediate with the Third French Republic, and for a good while, the Germans actually were getting on quite good. You have, for example, the Congress of Berlin, where the great powers of Europe met as equal partners, and things were going pretty good for a while, but eventually the age of imperialism came to an end, and by the time of the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, the European powers began to realize that they were out of land to take and claim as their own. And this is when the buildup, or the military buildup of extreme rivalries was taking shape. So Europe was a powder box. Europe has always been like this. It's always been very divided in and of itself. But the main reason why the war happened was because of the ruling classes, especially in Britain. But actually, the British were the least interested in actually going into war. And the British were actually very reluctant to come to the defense of Belgium when the Kaiser violated Belgian neutrality. The father of, what's his name? Chamberlain, the Prime Minister, Chamberlain, his father actually tried to drive, he was the foreign secretary under one of the British prime ministers. I think it was Alfred Balfour at the turn of the century. Joseph Chamberlain, that's it. He was Joseph Chamberlain wanted to have an Anglo-German military alliance. You have to remember that Britain and France were very old rivals. The British and the French had been fighting each other in the 100 Years' War, the 1300s and the 1400s, and then all throughout the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s, the French and the English were fighting in the War of the League of Augsburg, the 9 Years' War, the War of the Spanish Succession, the War of the Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War, the American War of Independence, the French Revolutionary Wars, and the Napoleonic Wars. So it was only with the Crimean War that this started to change. And in 1871, the British Prime Minister, what's his name? Disraeli said that Germany was a very dangerous, antagonistic power. Benjamin Disraeli claimed that there would be a war that Germany would start because Germany, under Prussian influence, was becoming a very strong autocratic state that was highly militarized, and it would disrupt the balance of power. But Queen Victoria did absolutely nothing when the Germans the Prussians had a war with Denmark. So in 1864, Prussia and Austria fought a war against Denmark for Schleswig and Holstein. And Queen Victoria, who was of German origin, she had married a German prince, and that's how the British monarchy today is the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. They changed the name to Windsor, but back then, Victoria was related to all of the German and Greek and Russian and Danish royals, and she was related to both the Danes and the Prussians, and she remained neutral. Most of the British Parliament opposed the war that Prussia was making and supported Denmark, but Queen Victoria supported Prussia. In 1867, with the war between Prussia and Austria, the British again were neutral, and so were the Belgians and the Dutch. In 1871, Britain declared neutrality, and at first, the British were actually very antagonistic and resentful of the French, because the French were supposedly the leaders of culture, fine culture, food and etiquette, and all this other garbage. And generally, the British tended to favor the Protestant Prussians over the Catholic French. But after some atrocities were committed by the Prussians in the Franco-Prussian War, the British Foreign Office, or the British Home Office, and Parliament started to send some aid to Napoleon III. But the French lost the Franco-Prussian War. Germany unified. And for example, there were a lot of British Germanophiles like Euston Stewart Chamberlain. In fact, Euston Stewart Chamberlain wrote The Foundations of the 19th Century. He was a very strong anti-Semite, if you would like to not use that term, but he would have been referred to as a strong English anti-Semite, and he was a very strong Nordicist. And Hitler and the Nazis got a lot of their ideas from the Thule Society and from Euston Stewart Chamberlain and his Foundations of the 19th Century. In fact, Alfred Rosenberg based his The Myth of the 20th Century on that book. So there were a few French and British Germanophiles, but most of the British and the Germans were highly imbued with religious and national propaganda about the Germans being backward. There was always this perceived notion that Germany was the heartland of the barbarian tribes. And these barbarians had invaded and wrecked, destroyed, and ruined the classical civilization of Rome, and brought an end to antiquity and wrought forth the horrendous Dark Ages, where you have the barbarians and the Vikings and disruption of culture in Europe, at least in Western Europe, Northwestern Europe, which is kind of weird because the English were pushing Anglo-Saxonism. This was the golden age of imperialism, and the English were pushing social Darwinism. They were social Darwinists. Sir Francis Galton, a lot of these people, for example, that fought in the Boer War, they were extreme Darwinists. They believed in the survival of the fittest. And at the same time that they were very proud of their stout, tall, blondish Anglo-Saxon ancestors and Celtic ancestors, they were also virulently anti-German. They saw the Germans as barbarians. That's what you see in World War I propaganda with the German Hun. The Germans as wild, backward ape men. They would just kill and commit horrendous atrocities. But there were also a lot of British people that loved German culture. They loved the fine poetry of Goethe or Goethe. They read the writings of Martin Luther. For example, in the 1800s, there was a Baptist and Methodist revival in Britain, especially centered in Wales and in the north of England that was happening. And there was a big revival and interest in stuff, and this is also the Pentecostal movement. And there was also a revival of Catholicism in Britain as well in the Victorian period. For example, the papacy in the 1840s and 1850s re-established its episcopal sees in England for the first time since Henry VIII. 300 years. And the religious intolerance towards Catholics came to an end largely. Daniel O'Connor, the Irish nationalist, did a lot to help to emancipate the Irish and to get back some of their land that they had lost from Cromwell in the 1600s. But the Irish were building a lot of Republican and socialist parties. You had, for example, the United Irishmen, Sinn Féin, and a lot of these very anti-British, anti-imperialist, and pro-Republican parties. And right at the cusp of World War I, the British were fighting the Boers in South Africa, and they referred to the Boers as intolerant farmers that were treating the black people terribly. They were enslaving and treating the blacks in South Africa miserably, and they were also denying citizenship to British nationals in the Boer republics of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. And also the British coveted the diamonds and stuff, so there was a couple of Boer wars. And the last of those broke out in 1899 and ended in 1902, and there was basically a genocide of these white Calvinist farmers in which you have an entire establishment that is very Darwinist, very influenced by the ideas of Darwin and eugenics, which were beginning to come of age. And they basically saw the Dutch and the Huguenot and German Boers as subhuman. And they just starved them to death, these Boers. So there was a genocide of the Boers, and the British were also denying some civil rights to the Irish. In fact, in Ulster was set up as a colony by James I Stuart, and he settled Presbyterian Scots in Ulster, and there was some Welsh and English that also went there and mixed with the predominant Scots, who also mixed with some native Irish. But by the early 1900s, there was a strong hint of unionism in Northern Ireland with the Protestant Scotch-Irish. They wanted to stay in the Empire. And then you have the rest of the mostly Catholic Irish who wanted to have a republic, or at least have a white dominion in Ireland in the same nature as Canada or Australia, or just become a completely separate republic on the model of the United States. Now, across the Atlantic in the United States, America was expanding and finishing up Manifest Destiny, and the settlers and the pioneers were finishing off killing the last of the Indians. There is this notion about the myth of the vanishing Indian, and the Yankees were expanding to the Pacific, and then there was a war with Spain. So there was a war with Spain. And there's a slogan called Remember the Maine, take revenge against Spain or get back at Spain. So the Spanish-American War was sort of a continuation of the Union War effort in the Civil War. The ideas of American democracy and liberty were the most profound of such doctrines of the Enlightenment in the entire world that has probably ever existed, perhaps, where you have the Americans fighting a war for independence against the British Empire, influenced by the ideas of Freemasonry and the Enlightenment. And then you have the Civil War, where the North had greater resources and industry and won that war with overwhelming numbers and force of arms. And what the Union did was they utilized European immigrants from Irish, Germans, Swedes and Danes and Norwegians and other people from Europe, the European working classes that wanted to have free labor, and the freed slaves that were freed from emancipation. And that's how they were able to win the Civil War. And this kind of propagates what is called the second founding of America, which is basically sort of a more fulfilling principle of giving American citizenship to everyone that believes in the Constitution and democracy. It's sort of an extension of what happened in 1776. So you have America that won a war with Spain, expanded from ocean to ocean, and is looking to try to get colonies for resources in the Philippines. America's fighting the Banana Wars, and so in 1912, there is this sort of a compromise. Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, is elected president, and he is pushing the progressive movement in America. And there is a compromise between Northerners and white Southerners. Well, white Northerners and Southerners. So, for the first time since the Civil War, racial segregation returns back into mainstream America. Previously, it only happened in the western states and in the South, in the defeated former Confederacy. But then Woodrow Wilson, with some new neo-Confederate propaganda that he spread, successfully made segregation possible again in Washington, D.C., And most of the American establishment supported segregation and supported the notions of white supremacy, which is very interesting, given the context that America went into World War I to spread democracy and defeat these wicked, evil autocracies, allegedly, that was represented in Germany. So I'm going to read some comments right fast. Let's go! Let's go! Richard Murdoch says Germany was also going into Africa and helping with utilizing their natural resources. Europe did not want Germany to become a superpower. Well, that's not entirely true, Richard Murdoch. Joseph Chamberlain, who was British, highly favored Germany being the dominant power in Europe. But by the turn of the century, most of the British establishment felt that a strong Germany would disrupt the balance of power. And the fact that the Germans did not have a fully elective democracy, and they had no sense of Magna Carta, the Germans did not have the legacy of Magna Carta or habeas corpus, or the compromise of the British Constitution of 1688, and a bunch of other stuff that came into the British and American constitutions. It was felt that the Prussians had denied their citizens proper laws of equality and the proper revolution of the Enlightenment. There was the influence of the Code de Napoleon, which went into the Rhine Confederation, but that was by far the most democratic Germany ever got. The revolution of 1848 failed in the Germanies, and because of that, Germany slipped back into autocracy. But Germany was a very modern and very well-developed nation. It overtook France and then overtook Britain, and it was almost about as strong as America by the eve of World War I. Germany was the second most builder of railroads and factories, and the second biggest producer of coal and oil by just before World War I. And even after World War I, too. Rick Perry says the heartland theory, Germany and Russia were the largest land armies and needed to be neutralized. Oh yeah, you're talking about that guy, that British geopolitician that was what was his name? Mackinder. Mackinder's theory about how central Russia and the Ural Mountains were the heartland. And whoever was able to conquer the heartland could rule all of Eurasia. That's interesting, dude. That's very interesting. But the Anglo-American establishment's main goal in the 20th century, of course, Rick Perry, was to neutralize the land powers of Russia and Germany and keep them from becoming stronger than the British or the Americans, right? So that was the Anglo-American establishment. The world wars were the prelude to globalization. Yes, they were. Make love, not war. Joke. The British, through Chamberlain, tried to create the German eugenics movement since World War I. The Nazi Party of World War II was the fulfillment of that drive. Didn't you say that Hitler thought that the Prophet Muhammad was a better religious figure for Hitler and the Nazis than Jesus was? Because I know that a lot of the Nazis wanted to get rid of Christianity, or they wanted to distort and change the synapses of the gospel with the Reich Church, the state Reich churches in the Third Reich. The Anglo-American establishment have been behind the entire globalist agenda. Yeah, they have. Carol C. Quigley's The Anglo-American Establishment, as well as Anthony C. Sutton's works are a good example. Hi, Shandy. It's Little Shimmy, people, let's go! Forge gang! What's up, Chauncey Fat Sat? Let's go! Hard man! Your present cell looks nicer than mine. Thanks, bro. Yeah, I try to keep it up, with the looks and the furniture. I've got a lot of books and some VHS tapes, and that's about it. Listen up, plebs. Ford School is now in session. That's right! Alright, so how in the world was it that in 1914, at the very pinnacle, you could say, of Northern European cultural ascension and just basically Northern European dominance, how in the world was it that in this age where race and racial distinctions were the norm, how was it that the Europeans would end up turning on each other and killing each other? Well, if you've read the book by British historian that wrote The Sleepwalkers, how Europe basically sleepwalked into World War I, that's one example. There is also, in Germany, there is this kind of school that emerged in the 1960s that says that Germany is to blame for everything. That's probably not entirely correct. Britain and France were as imperialist and expansionistic with nationalism as much as the Germans were. For just as much as the Prussians or the Germans were putting up statues of Frederick the Great and Karl the Great, in England, statues of Alfred the Great, what was their names? Alfred the Great, Queen Boudica, Elizabeth I, Queen Victoria, William the Conqueror, Henry VIII, etc., Oliver Cromwell. They were putting up statues of that. In France, they put up statues of Vercingetorix, Charlemagne, Napoleon, Louis XIV, and all of their different rulers from the houses of Bourbon, Valois, and Bonaparte. So, this was basically a very strong nationalist movement. Also, in Germany, before World War I, there was this neo-pagan movement that von List created, and it was called the Volkist movement. And although in World War I, the Volkists and the Thule Society and the German Order were not really the major influence on the Kaiserreich, they had a lot of influence, for example, on Ludendorff. Ludendorff was a Nordicist. He believed in the blonde, blue-eyed Nordic race, and it was the only legitimate superior race. And Ludendorff, he was kind of an expositor of reviving pre-Christian Germanic paganism, and he was doing this in World War I and right after World War I. So there was a neo-folkish movement that already existed before even the Nazis. The German Naval League, or the Imperial German Navy League, had a lot of anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish, and pro-German stuff going on in there. And a lot of that influence crept into the Nazi movement as well. Another thing that was happening also, there was a lot of influence from people like von List. A lot of Madame Blavatsky's works were being translated into German. And there was a lot of occult movements or occultic movements that were spreading around Europe, both in England and in Germany in the 1800s. There was a very strong occultic influence and interest in psychics and fortune-telling and stuff, and a lot of the English, French, and German elites were highly involved in esoteric psychic readings and going to psychic mediums, and they would sit at a table like this. They would join around in hands, and they would try to talk to spirits. They would have a psychic in the chair on the table. The other people would get around the table, and they would grab hands. They would get around the table, and they would try to have an intercession with the spirits of the dead. So there was a lot of that happened in the early 1900s, trying to mediate with the dead, trying to have psychic readings and stuff. That was very common at the turn of the 20th century, late Victorian age. Now, in the Edwardian period, scientific secularist advancement for the first time started to take hold in Western society. And in the Edwardian period, between the Boer War and the Second Anglo-Boer War and World War I, the scientific method and a lot of Darwinian scientific secular practices and thoughts started to kind of weed out this kind of magician, magical influence and stuff. And so because of that, a lot of it started to go underground. And this was already happening even before World War I. These occult movements are always the result of the Ars Quaetorior Coronati, Lodge of Masonic Research, who devised the heavy dope for the social engineering programs. So a lot of Freud's influences were taken from them. I know that Aleister Crowley, did you know that Aleister Crowley was a big supporter of the Nazis? A lot of high-ranking Nazis were very close to Aleister Crowley. And also, there is a lot of high-ranking Nazis, for example, that read the Quantons of that Jesuit guy, that French Jesuit from the 16th century. What was his? Yeah, it was Nostradamus. A lot of, and it wasn't just the Nazis, but a lot of world leaders were reading the works of Nostradamus. A lot of people were engaging in occult rituals. They were reading tarot cards. They were engaging in trying to interpret the spirits of the dead. The writer of Sherlock Holmes and von Ludendorff, Paul von Ludendorff, they were engaging in these kind of occult practices. I'm pretty sure they were. Also, around World War I, the terminology for German National Socialism first appeared on the scene. So there's a lot of occult revival that was going on before World War I. The British Foreign Office was set up in 1915, just 1 year after the outbreak of World War I. So now, to get back on track, how does all of this stuff relate to World War I? Well, for one thing, Otto von Bismarck kicked the Jesuits out of Bavaria in 1871. When Germany united in the Second Reich, the Jesuit order was expelled from all of Germany. Now, they had agents in Germany. You know, there were still the Freemasons in Germany, but in 1916, Kaiser Wilhelm II allowed the Jesuits back into Germany, or Imperial Germany. So, isn't that interesting? The British apparently were letting the Jesuit order into Britain as early as 1760 or 1750. So the Jesuits and the Freemasons already had a lot of influence in Europe, because Europe was the center of the world. Now, even in the late 1800s, the Jesuit order, which were trying to co-opt America, they wanted America to overtake Europe. And the reason why was because all over Europe, the Jesuit order was expelled. They were expelled from Spain, from France, the Netherlands, Belgium. They were expelled from Prussia, Austria, and from Russia under Alexander I. There was also a lot of pogroms of Jews that were happening in the Russian Empire. The Russians were fed up with Jewish subversion and influence in Tsarist Russia, and a bunch of pogroms broke out, and they basically kicked the Jews out of Tsarist Russia. So the Jews that immigrated to New York, to London and Paris, were trying to organize a plot to overthrow the Tsar. The Anglo establishment, the Freemasonic Anglo establishment, collaborated with these Jews in dethroning the Tsar. Now, the Jews did not engineer the Russian Bolshevik Revolution. Anthony Sutton explains that it was the Anglo-American establishment that did that, but there was a lot of involvement of lower-ranking Freemasonic Jews like Leon Bronstein Trotsky, who engineered the October Revolution, which was not the same revolution that actually overthrew the Tsar. It was the February Revolution, but that's a different story. I'm talking about World War I. So, Britain and Germany had the naval arms race. It's called the Anglo-German arms race. It broke out, has a rivalry with von Tirpitz and the German Kriegsmarine and the British Royal Navy in 1896. And then also, there was the great Anglo-German naval arms race, and that was an important cornerstone for how this happened. But what was that guy's name that tried to run for president? LaRouche, that's it. LaRouche said that the British establishment were trying to set up another 7 years' war in order to destroy their main rival, Germany, which was an economic rival. So Britain and Germany were not political rivals or geopolitical rivals. They were mostly economic rivals. But if you actually understand the full significance of economics and the full significance of how imperial and high finance economics play in the role of monopolistic dominance, the British Empire was just a bunch of different private corporations, mercantile private corporations that competed, but they all had the one thing in common, that they operated under the Union Jack, or the British Union Jack. And the Germans, coincidentally, they also had rival industrial monopolistic companies that were also competing for resources. And these different industrial baron corporations competed with international entities. That, my friends, is how World War I really happened. Lyndon LaRouche claims that it was actually primarily the British ruling class and the American ruling classes that wanted to generate another 7 years' war, but instead of France, Bourbon France, it was going to be Hohenzollern Germany. The late 1700s was the time the Jesuits became subverted by the mercantile order. Not surprising, the British let them return in 1750. Well, they came in with Bloody Mary and they were kicked out by Elizabeth Tudor. And then they came back with George II because in 1750, George II was the king. And that was right at the end of the Jacobite risings, right? The Jesuits worked with the British mercantile order in the British East India Company. Oh yeah, they did. You know, it's very interesting about Germany. Germany was one of the predominant anti-Semitic, least influenced by Jews in Europe. They were also one of the most racially pure people in Europe. Okay, it looks like my transmission is messing up. I might have to get a little bit closer to my router. I'm not a big specialist in internet connections and stuff. My internet is trash. My internet is absolute garbage, bro. So Rick Perry says that the Jesuit order was working in the British East India Company. So the Jesuits were the ones that drove the British into putting down the Sepoy Mutiny, actually. They were the ones that tried to drive the British into taking over India and turning it into the crown of the empire, because in 1877, Benjamin Disraeli made Queen Victoria Empress of all of India in the succession of the Mughals, or the Mughal lineage. So Queen Victoria took over from the Mughals, the dynasty that was founded by Akbar back in the early 1500s, and ruled India until the English East India Company went in there in the 18th century. And kick the French out. All right, so, so you could probably say that World War I was the first process of what could be considered the Second 30 Years' War. Eugene Weber says that from 1914 to 1945, the Europeans drove themselves into a great uproar of battle and conflict that only ended with American Yankee and Soviet supremacy and ascension in 1945. And also when Hitlerite Germany was wiped out, completely obliterated and destroyed, as per the plans of the Anglo-American establishment and their designs. So what did Germany supposedly do wrong? Well, nothing really. I mean, the Germans were not really more racist or anti-Semitic than the Russians or the French or the English or the Italians. But the propaganda of the barbarian tribes, like the utilization about these Germanic barbarians and their destruction of civilization and higher culture, this kind of propaganda. And also the Germans supported the Boers, and the British really resented that. So one of the things that turned the English against the Germans was the Boers. The Boers were given weapons and they were being supported by the Germans, and the British did not like that. They were also giving arms and weapons to the Catholic United Irishmen, or the United Irishmen. But what's so funny about that is that the Ulster Scots, or the Irish Unionists, were also getting guns and arms from the Germans in early 1914. So isn't that interesting? But London took a blind eye with the British Unionists who were getting armed and getting weapons and guns from the Germans, and only paid attention to the Republican United Irishmen getting guns from the Germans. Interesting. I'm drinking white rum, a fittingly drink for these pirate topics. Ire, matey, I'll be thy great whale in vengeance at thee, matey. Where be the golden treasure chest of warrior? I'll dump you into Casey Jones's locker if ye don't surrender that treasure. Dude, I need alcohol to drink. I can't stand not drinking any intoxic liquor. I'm a type of person to where I can go on long terms without drinking, but then I need to drink, okay? There's nothing like making a white man mad and denying him some booze, okay? You see, most people of color, they have a horrible time holding their liquor. It's only white people that can hold their liquor, and especially the Irish. The Irish are great drinkers. The Irish are some of the best drinkers, and they can hold their liquor, okay? Only white people can hold their liquor, okay? They can drink until full intoxication and not get excessively drunk, bro. That's a fact. That's a fact, you know? It's a real fact, bro. Alright, so there is also propaganda about how the Germans were mistreating black people in Namibia. So all of the Namaka and these other black tribes that were in Namibia that the Germans were supposedly viciously putting down and genociding, there was a bunch of propaganda against the Imperial Germans saying that they were committing a horrendous race war against the Namaka people and against these different Bushmen people in Southern Africa and stuff, and how the Germans were engaging in slavery. So really, a lot of the propaganda against the Central Powers, and especially the Germans in World War I, was exactly the same as what was done against the Confederates in the Civil War, too. So, like, how do you like my sword? Shiver me timbers, matey. Give me that treasure chest, might I? Shiver me timbers, matey. My alcohol tolerance is legendary. Oh, here's William Glory Hole bringing in his typical blue-pilled boomer nonsense. His typical boomer blue-pilled crap. He thinks that I watch the BBC. I guess he's never seen a book in his entire life. I guess he's never seen a book that's thicker than a magazine in his entire life, have you, bro? So anyways, oh, so you don't know what LARPing is, you idiot? Oh, dude, I have a lawnmower blade, and I'm pretending that I'm a pirate right now. Oh, that must be dangerous. It's dangerous to have a lawnmower blade and have adrenaline and testosterone flowing through your body there. Well, shiver me timbers, matey. I guess you don't know what LARPing is. What do you call Dungeons and Dragons and Magic the Gathering, you idiot? So anyways, considering the fact that there was such a strong competition between the ruling classes and the different business magnates and monopolistic interests in 1914, and there was all of this outbreak of nationalism, is it no wonder that in 1914, British Broadcasting Company What about it, you dumb fuck? Oh, I don't know what the BBC means. Oh, dude, you just got felted hard. You got felted by a hard man, baby. Woo! You got felted, baby. Let's go! All right, so shiver me timbers, mateys. We got to talk about World War I. What happened here? What was the context of why the Jesuits started this war? Because they wanted to wipe out and destroy the Protestant English and Germans. They wanted to destroy the legacy of the Protestant Reformation in Prussia and in England. Destroy the flower of their youth in the trenches of the Marne and Flanders, and wipe out and weaken these countries. They also wanted to get back at the liberal Catholic French for kicking them out during the French Revolution. You know, Napoleon was a Freemason. Napoleon was a 32nd Freemason, and he was a carrier of the Jesuit ideas of Freemasonry and the Jesuit order. And Napoleon was just used by the Jesuits and the Freemasons to go around Europe and ransack all of these cities of their art, of like their artwork and their sculptures and all of their culture, and take it back to his little museum in Paris. Like, Napoleon was a big advocate of French supremacy. He was very much a very staunch French nationalist, even though he was of Corsican origin. Kaiser Wilhelm II was a very strong advocate of German supremacy and Nordicism. He was basically a Volkist and a Nordicist, even though he was not as so openly admitted to it as such, but he was definitely an advocate of absolute monarchical autocracy and also Nordicism as well as eugenics, and also just in general breaking the balance of power, getting back at the Brits, and basically trying to have world dominance. There were quite a few Germans in World War I that wanted to have global dominance. But most Germans really did not want to do that. The vast majority of Germans were not pushing this kind of stuff. They were sleepwalkers that went into war in 1914 with the French, with the British, or the English, with the Canadians, the Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, with everybody else. But when the Germans violated Belgian neutrality, that was pretty much the cusp of what pushed the British into defending an 1839 treaty, 1837 treaty to protect Belgium. And that finally got them into the war. France went into war because of Russia. Russia got into the war because of Serbia. So it was a process of sleepwalkers going into World War I. It was a catastrophe in the making that most people were simply not aware was going to happen. That simply felt as if they weren't going into a war. There was going to eventually be a war, but it just happened. And so you have this massive industrialized slaughtering and killing that was taking place. You have battles and wars in the Far East, in the Middle East, in Africa. You have socialist parties or left-wing socialist parties that were trying to support against the war. For example, all of the major socialist parties or social democratic parties typically opposed the war, and then there was a branch of these, of Reformed Social Democrats, that supported the war and favored the war and went with the conservatives in pushing the war effort. So, for the British, fighting in World War I was to prove the superiority of the Anglo-Saxon peoples, the freedom-loving Anglo-Saxon peoples against the villainous Prussian autocrats and Prussian militarism. Of course, at the start of World War I, this wasn't an obvious thing, but as the propaganda built up, has this pro-war, pro-French Republican influence seeped into the British and American ruling establishment, even as the war went very badly for the English and the French, and the Germans actually won a lot of campaigns early on, and they were pretty tough, very strong and tough fighters. The ultimate end result was that this pro-French, pro-Belgium, pro-war propaganda seeped through against this notion of Prussian militarism. So, 1914 to 1915 was kind of a draw. The Ottoman Empire came in. You have the Dardanelles campaign, which was kind of a bad blunder on the part of the Brits. You come into 1916, and there is some important turning points with the Battle of the Somme, the Battle of the Marne, the Second Battle of the Marne, and the Battle of Flanders. The Battle of the Somme, like 100,000 British people die in the Battle of the Somme. You have a lot of British and Commonwealth soldiers that die in this battle, trying to fight for England, trying to fight for the ancient liberties of Magna Carta, of William Wallace, and the Declaration of Arbroath, and the Glorious Revolution and the Constitution and the Reform Bills of 1832. They're fighting the wicked barbarian Huns and so forth, and all this other nonsensical propaganda that was being pushed and was coming across the Atlantic to America, beginning with the Lusitania. So in 1916, lots of great battles are being fought, but a lot of high casualties on both the sides, on both the Allied and the Central Power sides. So, also the Russians. It should not be underestimated the importance of the Russians on the Eastern Front. The Russians did a lot to help relieve the British and the French and the Belgians from German aggression. The Salonika front and the Mesopotamian fronts that were opened up were also helpful. And in a great twist of irony, the Japanese, who were part of the Allies, were very helpful in taking Sanchao, or in taking a port city in China that was being leased to the Germans. The siege of Tsingtao. The Japanese and the British and Australians fought together, and they quailed the Germans and took Tsingtao from the Germans and defeated them. The Austro-Hungarians and the Germans also had imperial gains in Shanghai, yes. The Germans and the Austrians had exclusion zones in Shanghai until World War I, and the Allies also took that away from them. So, most of the fighting in Africa was done against the Germans and the native Hapsars, the black native Africans that were under Imperial German control. And the British, the French, and the Commonwealth forces very quickly snapped all of the African colonies away from Germany except Uganda. Uganda took a longer time for the British and the Commonwealth forces to take away from the Germans. In the Middle East, the 700-year-old Ottoman Empire which was basically the sick man of Europe. You have the Ottomans. They were not really prepared for World War I. They had just fought a war with Italy and were defeated by Italy, and the Italians had taken Libya in 1912. So the Ottoman Empire was in a very weak and a very, I guess you could say, deracinated state. But they were very pro-German, and they took the side of the Germans, and the Kaiser actually tried to rally the entire Islamic world around the cause of the Central Powers. Now, this did not work, and in the end, the Arabs revolted, and with the Balfour Declaration, the Zionists were promised a homeland for the Jews in Palestine. So the Balfour Declaration was a success, and a lot of Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses, as well as liberal Catholics and evangelical Protestants, were very strong supporters of the Balfour Declaration. Ever since the days of Oliver Cromwell, a lot of Anglo-Protestants had been pushing the idea that Jesus would only return in the second coming if the Jews were allowed to return to the Holy Land and build the third temple in order to usher in the new Messianic age. So all throughout the 19th century, there was attempts by Anglo-Christians, primarily Protestants, and especially Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses, in trying to help the Jews return back to the Holy Land. So you have a lot of radical Protestant movements and even some Catholics that were trying to get the Balfour Declaration to happen, and in 1916 that became a reality. Now, in 1917, there was a revolution in Russia, and Russia lost the Tsar. And you have a lot of these agents working for Wall Street, working for the City of London, to court this revolution. And by the end of the year, the Bolsheviks had taken power in Petrograd. And so you have this fringe wing of the Social Democrats, the Russian Socialist Democratic Labor Party, that broke up into the Mensheviks and Bolsheviks. And the Bolsheviks, together with SRs or other leftist SRs, took over Moscow and Petrograd and Vladivostok or whatever, and founded Soviet Russia. And this was the beginning of the communist movement. Vladimir Lenin was a very big supporter of the anti-imperialist League, and he was virulently against World War I. The communists, the Bolsheviks, were all opposed to Russia and Europe being in World War I. So after the October Revolution, Russia was pulled out of World War I, and it fell into a major civil war. But that was the origins of communism, of the communist movement, and the beginnings of what would later become the Cold War. All right, so Austria-Hungary actually tried to pull out of World War I a lot of times. And what ultimately happened was they tried to make a treaty with France and with Great Britain, and it failed, and they stayed in the war. And Franz Joseph died, and he was replaced with a weaker emperor known as Charles I, or Charles II of Habsburg. He tried to create an imperial league, and this is the irony. Archduke Franz Ferdinand wanted to create an equal imperial federation under the Habsburgs, where all the different ethnicities of Austria-Hungary would have an equal say. The Yugoslav nationalists, the South Slavic nationalists, did not want that, So they assassinated him in Sarajevo because they wanted to destroy Austria-Hungary and replace it with a Yugoslavia. So that's what ultimately happened. And in 1918, the Czechs, the Slovaks, the Slovenians, and the Croats all rebelled, and that was the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian army. Also, the Italians won the important naval battle of Vittorio Veneto. That was primarily a naval battle, and it completely destroyed the entire Austro-Hungarian Imperial Royal Navy. The Imperial Austrian and Royal Hungarian Navy was utterly destroyed by the Italian Royal Navy. And then also the Italians were pushing up into South Tyrol.